After 44 years of sawdust and devotion, my stepchildren looked me dead in the eyes and called me the hired help. The day Vivian's heart stopped beating, they carved up $18 million like vultures over a carcass and tossed me a single iron key wrapped in paper. They laughed at an old carpenter's poverty, but that key didn't open a door. It opened a vault of secrets that burned their empire to ash. Hello, and welcome to this story. Before we discover why a rusted iron key was left to me after 44 years of marriage, please like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Also note, this is a fictional story created for storytelling purposes, offering meaningful and enriching ideas. The air inside Pemberton's office tasted like polished leather and cold mathematical finality. I sat in a high-backed chair on the 67th floor of Willis Tower, Chicago spreading out beneath me like a blueprint I had never been invited to sign. My name is Walter Brennan. Most people call me Walt. I am 72 years old, a retired master carpenter whose hands still carry the calluses of 10,000 joints fitted, 10,000 beams measured, 10,000 nails driven home with a precision that never once failed me. But in that room, surrounded by mahogany panels and men in suits that cost more than my truck, I felt as disposable as a stripped screw. Vivian had been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of silence so heavy it felt like the foundation of my life had been pulled out from underneath me without warning. And now her children, the 4 people I had raised since they were barely old enough to hold a hammer, sat across from me with the coordinated patience of predators who had already divided the kill. Garrett Hargrove sat closest to the window, 56 years old, with the rigid posture of a man who believed he already owned the skyline. His jaw was set in a permanent clench, venture capital eyes scanning the room as though he were appraising an acquisition rather than mourning his mother. Beside him, Nadia Hargrove, 53, crossed her legs with the practiced elegance of a woman who had spent her life managing appearances. She tapped a lacquered nail against the armrest in a rhythm that suggested impatience rather than grief. Jensen Hargrove couldn't keep his knee from bouncing. At 50, he still carried the nervous energy of a gambler watching the wheel spin, his eyes darting between the lawyer's folder and the door as though calculating his fastest exit. And finally, Margot, the youngest at 48. She examined her phone screen with a studied indifference that I had once mistaken for shyness, but now recognized as something far colder. Pemberton cleared his throat. The sound was dry and mechanical, like the click of a deadbolt sliding into place. He began reading the primary distribution of Vivian Hargrove's estate, $18 million. The number hung in the air like smoke. I listened as he carved it into portions, listing the properties along Lakeshore Drive, the shares in Hargrove Design Group, the liquid accounts spread across institutions I had never heard of. All of it, every cent, flowing toward the 4 people who had spent the last decade treating me like furniture that had overstayed its usefulness. Then came the section that broke me. Pemberton read it without inflection, as though the words were nothing more than a standard clause in a standard document. Vivian's will officially classified our 44-year marriage as on-site manual labor. I was described as a domestic maintenance consultant who had been adequately compensated during his tenure through room and board. Have you ever felt the ground dissolve beneath your feet while a room full of people watched you sink? 44 years, reduced to a line item, erased with the stroke of a legal pen. Garrett let out a sharp laugh that cracked against the mahogany panels like a rifle shot. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a grin so wide I could count every veneer. 44 years of free carpentry, he said. Not a bad gig if you think about it. Nadia didn't laugh. She did something worse. She slid a business card across the table toward me. I glanced down. It was for a low-income senior housing facility on the south side. Just in case you need a soft landing, she murmured, not bothering to look up from her phone. Pemberton slid a worn brown envelope across the desk without meeting my eyes. This constitutes the remainder of your allocation, Mr. Brennan, he said. His voice held the kind of professional pity that made my stomach turn. I stared at the envelope. It was heavier than paper should be. Something inside shifted with a dull metallic scrape. Jensen stood up and buttoned his jacket, already mentally boarding whatever private flight they had chartered to celebrate. Margot followed, dropping her phone into a designer bag without a backward glance. But it was Garrett who delivered the final blow. He leaned close as he passed my chair, his breath smelling of expensive coffee and inherited contempt. "I restructured the family trusts 20 years ago," he whispered. "You were never going to see a cent, Walt. Mother just didn't have the heart to tell you while she was alive." They filed out as a single unit, a wall of tailored wool and coordinated cruelty. The door closed behind them with a soft, expensive click that sounded more final than any nail I had ever driven. I sat alone in the silence. The envelope lay in my palm, and I could feel the shape of something inside. Not paper, not a check. Something cold and angular, and impossibly heavy for its size. My fingers found the edge of the seal, and I tore it open with hands that refused to remain steady. A key fell onto the polished desk. Iron. Old. Heavy as a railroad spike. It hit the wood with a sound like a judge's gavel. Tied to it by a length of fraying twine was a small leather tag, aged and cracked. But it wasn't the key that stopped my breathing. It was the paper wrapped around it. A piece of architectural drafting paper, folded down to the size of a playing card. I unfolded it with trembling fingers and saw lines I recognized instantly. The proportions, the angles, the particular way the roofline met the chimney at exactly 14 degrees. This was my sketch. A drawing I had made on the back of a restaurant receipt 35 years ago during a dinner I thought Vivian had forgotten. She hadn't thrown it away. She had kept it, refined it, and turned it into something I couldn't yet understand. In the bottom corner, written in her unmistakable architect's hand, were 2 words and a set of coordinates. Mackinac Island. I stared at those words until the evening light shifted and the office grew dim around me. My wife had left me nothing but a key and a drawing of my own forgotten dream. And in that moment, I didn't know whether to weep for the life I had lost or for the secret she had clearly taken to her grave. I drove through the darkening streets of Chicago with the envelope on the passenger seat, the iron key pressing against the paper like a heartbeat trapped inside a coffin. The skyline I had helped shape with my own hands, fitting crown moldings in penthouses, restoring century-old staircases in brownstones, building custom shelving for architects who never learned my name, towered above me with a cold indifference that matched the temperature inside that lawyer's office. The penthouse on Lakeshore Drive had been my home for 31 years. Vivian and I moved there in 1992, the year Hargrove Design Group landed its first major municipal contract. I remembered carrying her over the threshold, both of us laughing at the absurdity of a carpenter living 60 floors above the earth. She had squeezed my hand and whispered that every skyscraper needs a foundation man. I believed her then. The elevator opened onto the private foyer, and I knew immediately that I was no longer welcome. The air smelled different, not the warm cedar and linseed oil of our shared life, but something sterile and aggressive, a commercial cleaning chemical that erased rather than preserved. Garrett and Nadia were already inside. They had beaten me home, and they hadn't come to grieve. A woman in a charcoal blazer moved through the living room with a digital measuring tape, calling out dimensions into a tablet while Garrett pointed at walls and furniture as though he were surveying a demolition site. They didn't acknowledge my presence. They spoke about me in the third person, the way you discuss a load-bearing wall you intend to remove. "The carpenter's room needs to be gutted first," Nadia said, gesturing toward the hallway that led to my study. "The smell of wood stain is embedded in the drywall. We will need a full renovation before the staging company can even begin." Garrett leaned against the kitchen island, arms crossed, watching me with the lazy satisfaction of a cat who had already cornered the mouse. "Still here?" he asked, his voice carrying that same jagged edge from the lawyer's office. "I figured you'd be halfway to a motel by now." I didn't answer him. I walked past the woman with the measuring tape, past the kitchen where I had cooked 10,000 meals that nobody ever thanked me for, and into the small study that Vivian had designated as mine. The room smelled like home, pine shavings, linseed, the faint ghost of pencil graphite. I closed the door and pressed my back against it, breathing. The architectural drawing was still in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and spread it flat on my workbench, the single overhead lamp casting a warm cone of light onto the paper. The lines were unmistakable. I had drawn this sketch on the back of a dinner receipt at a small Italian restaurant on Wells Street in 1988. It was a Victorian farmhouse. 3 stories. Wrap-around porch. A roofline that met the chimney at 14 degrees because I had calculated that angle would catch the morning light from the east and warm the kitchen without any direct glare. I remembered Vivian watching me draw it. She had leaned across the checkered tablecloth, her chin resting on her palm, and asked me what I was building. A house for us, I told her. Someday, when the kids are grown and the world gets quiet. She had smiled and folded the receipt into her purse. I assumed she threw it away the next morning. That was 35 years ago. Now I held it in my hands again, reproduced with architectural precision onto professional drafting paper. Every measurement exact, every angle preserved. And in the corner, her handwriting, coordinates that pointed to Mackinac Island, a place I had visited once as a boy with my grandfather, a place where horses still pulled carriages and the sound of engines didn't exist. A sharp electronic chime broke my concentration. I heard the familiar beep of the security panel in the hallway, followed by Garrett's voice speaking a series of numbers I didn't recognize. The system responded with a confirmation tone, and I understood with a sickening clarity what he had done. He had changed the access codes. While I stood in my own study holding the ghost of my wife's handwriting, her eldest son was erasing me from the building's memory. The digital lock on the front door would no longer recognize my fingerprint. The elevator would no longer respond to my code. I was being deleted in real time. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a confrontation. I pulled my old leather tool bag from beneath the workbench and began to pack. Not the heirlooms. Not the art Vivian had collected. I reached for the things that were truly mine. My hand planes, worn smooth by decades of use. My dovetail saw, its brass back, polished to a mirror finish. My folding rule, a gift from my father. The wood chisels I had sharpened so many times that their blades were half their original width. These were my true inheritance. These were the things no will could classify as adequate compensation. I waited. The penthouse grew quiet around midnight, as Garrett and Nadia left to celebrate at whatever restaurant served champagne to people with fresh blood on their hands. I waited longer still, sitting in the dark study with my tool bag on my lap and the iron key cold against my chest where I had tucked it inside my shirt. At 3 a.m, I carried my single suitcase and my tool bag down the service elevator, the one entrance they hadn't thought to recode, because it was the entrance for the help. The concrete stairwell smelled of bleach and recycled air, and my footsteps echoed with a hollow finality that reminded me of walking the inside of an empty bridge span. Every echo a reminder that the structure above was no longer mine to inspect. My truck sat in the basement garage where it had sat for 20 years. A 1998 Ford with rust on the wheel wells and 240,000 miles of honest work etched into its odometer. The engine turned over with a familiar diesel growl that felt more like a greeting than any sound I had heard in 3 weeks. I placed the envelope with the key and the drawing on the passenger seat, pulled out of the garage, and turned north. I didn't look at the penthouse in the rearview mirror. I had already said goodbye to that life. The moment Pemberton's voice turned my 44 years into a job description. But as I merged onto Lakeshore Drive, the dark water of Lake Michigan stretching endlessly to my right, I noticed a pair of headlights in my mirror. A black sedan, sitting 2 cars back, matching my speed with a patience that had nothing to do with traffic. Someone was following me, and they had been waiting for me to run. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the iron key pressing against my sternum like a second heartbeat, and pushed the accelerator toward the floor. 4 hours to Mackinac City. 4 hours to find out what Vivian had been hiding on an island where the world still moved at the speed of horses. Behind me, the headlights never wavered. The headlights followed me through 4 hours of interstate darkness, past the orange sprawl of suburban strip malls, past the long black stretches of farmland where the only light came from distant grain elevators blinking red against the sky, past the halfway point where Michigan thins into a finger of land pointing toward the Straits of Mackinac, and the air begins to taste of deep cold water and ancient stone. I watched that sedan in my mirror, the way I used to watch hairline fractures in load-bearing timber, patient, calculating, waiting for the moment. The pressure became too much, and the wood finally split. Whoever was behind that wheel had discipline. They never closed the gap below 3 car lengths, never fell back far enough to lose me. It was the kind of pursuit that told you more about the hunter's confidence than their haste. By the time I crossed the Mackinac Bridge at dawn, the straits churning gray and violent 500 feet below my tires, I had a plan. Not a complicated one. 44 years of fitting joints had taught me that the simplest solutions were always the strongest. You don't need 100 nails when 3 in the right place will hold a wall forever. Mackinac City appeared through the morning fog, like a ghost town between seasons. The tourist shops were shuttered, the fudge parlors dark. Only the ferry terminal showed signs of life, its parking lot dotted with early commuters and a handful of delivery trucks waiting to load supplies onto the island boats. I pulled into the lot and parked in a row of vehicles near the terminal entrance, positioning my truck between a large white delivery van and a family's oversized SUV. Then I waited. The black sedan rolled into the lot 40 seconds behind me. It cruised past my row once, then parked 3 rows back, with a clear sight line to my driver's side door. I could feel the weight of their attention like a hand on the back of my neck. I bought 2 ferry tickets at the automated kiosk, one for the 8:15 to Mackinac Island, one for the 8:20 to Round Island, a smaller vessel that departed from the adjacent dock. I walked toward the Round Island gate first, ticket visible in my hand, letting whoever was watching see exactly where I intended to go. I lingered near the boarding ramp until I saw the sedan's door open. A figure in a dark jacket stepped out and began moving toward the Round Island terminal. I turned, walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had forgotten something in his truck. And the moment I rounded the corner of the terminal building, out of their sight line, for exactly 9 seconds, I broke into the fastest walk my 72-year-old legs could manage and slipped through the Mackinac Island boarding gate just as the deckhand reached for the chain. The ferry pulled away from the dock with a shudder that traveled up through the steel deck and into the soles of my boots. I stood at the stern railing and watched the parking lot shrink, the black sedan still sitting in its space, its driver now standing beside the Round Island gate with a posture that suggested confusion rather than menace. A small, tired victory, but a victory nonetheless. The crossing took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of cold spray and engine vibration and the gradual emergence of Mackinac Island from the morning haze. It rose from the water like something from another century. White Victorian facades climbing the hillside, church steeples catching the first gold of sunrise, and not a single automobile in sight. No cars, no trucks, no engines of any kind. The island had banned motor vehicles over 100 years ago, and the world here still moved at the speed of horse hooves on packed earth. The absurdity of it struck me as the ferry docked. I had spent my entire life building things in a city that never stopped moving. And now I was stepping into a place that had simply decided to stop. The terminal was small and wooden, painted the same white as every other building on the waterfront. The smell hit me first. Wet cedar, horse leather, lake water on old stone. It was the smell of a world that still believed in the permanence of hand-built things, and it wrapped around me like a blanket I didn't know I needed. He was standing beside a black carriage hitched to a draft horse the color of wet iron. A man my age or older, 75 at least, with hands that looked like they'd been forged rather than born, silver hair cropped short, a leather apron over work clothes that smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. He held a small chalkboard sign with a single word written in block letters. "Brennan, you're late, Walt," he said before I could open my mouth. His voice was a rasp, like a file drawn across rough steel. "Vivian said you'd be prompt." I stared at him. "She told you I was coming?" Theo Voss looked at me with a patience that suggested he had been waiting for this question for a very long time. "She told me you'd come when the wolves finally showed their teeth," he replied, taking my suitcase and placing it in the back of the carriage with a practiced efficiency. 33 years I've been keeping that sign in my workshop. Figured I'd need it eventually. I climbed into the carriage, the leather seat creaking beneath my weight. The horse began to move without command, its hooves striking a rhythm on the hard-packed road that felt older than anything I had ever built. We turned away from the waterfront and climbed into the island's interior, where the buildings thinned and the forest closed in. Ancient oaks and maples arched overhead, their branches stitching together a canopy so thick the morning light filtered through in broken golden coins. "That sedan at the dock," I said after a long silence. "It wasn't Garrett's people?" Theo didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the road, one hand loose on the reins. "Protective detail," he said. "Vivian hired them through an offshore trust 8 years ago. Their only job was to make sure you reached this island alive once she was gone." The words hit me like a misaligned beam dropping from a scaffold. I had spent 4 hours in a fever of paranoia, convinced that Garrett's reach extended all the way to northern Michigan, and instead, I had outrun the only shield my dead wife had left me. "You lost them," Theo added, a hint of dark amusement in his raspy voice. "Vivian would have been impressed. She always said you were smarter than you let on." The carriage rounded a final bend, and Theo pulled the horse to a stop. Before us stood a pair of iron gates, tall and heavy, set into stone pillars that were furred with moss and age. The gates were closed, their surfaces streaked with rust that bled down the metalwork like old tears. But it wasn't the rust that stopped my breath. It was the pattern forged into the iron. The scrollwork, the angles, the specific way the curves met at their apex, in a shape I had drawn on a cocktail napkin at a fundraiser in 1987. I remembered that napkin. I remembered Vivian pulling it from beneath my wine glass with a laugh, saying I was the only man at a black-tie gala who brought his own blueprints. I assumed she had crumpled it into her evening bag and forgotten it by morning. She hadn't forgotten. She had forged it into iron. She had turned a throwaway doodle into the entrance of a world I never knew existed. I reached out from the carriage and touched the cold metal. The scrollwork was exactly as I had drawn it, scaled up to human size, every proportion preserved with the obsessive accuracy of someone who had studied my lines the way a musician studies a score. My fingerprints left smudges on the rust, and for the first time since Pemberton's office, I felt something other than grief. I felt seen. Theo took the iron key from my trembling hand and slid it into the lock with a familiarity that told me he had done this 1,000 times before. The mechanism turned without resistance. Despite the bleeding rust on the surface, the hinges moved with an effortless, oiled precision that mocked the decay of the exterior. I understood then that this place was a disguise. Neglect on the outside, perfection within. It was the architectural equivalent of the woman I had been married to for 44 years. The gates swung open onto a gravel drive that wound uphill through a cathedral of old-growth oak and sugar maple. The horse moved without instruction, its hooves crunching a rhythm into the packed stone as we climbed. Overhead, the branches wove together so completely that the sky became a stained glass window of green and gold, light falling through in shafts that illuminated the moss-covered earth like spotlights on a stage. The air thickened with the smell of damp bark and leaf mold and something else, something I couldn't name but recognized in my bones. The smell of a place that had been waiting. The drive curved one final time, and the trees fell away, like curtains drawn back from a window. I stopped breathing. It stood on the edge of a limestone cliff, 3 stories of hand-laid fieldstone and reclaimed timber, with a wraparound porch supported by columns that I knew, without needing to measure, were set at exactly the proportions I had sketched 35 years ago on that restaurant receipt. The roofline met the chimney at 14 degrees, The porch railings curved in the specific elliptical pattern I had calculated to follow the natural sweep of the lakeshore below. The morning light from the east hit the kitchen windows at precisely the angle I had designed to warm the room without glare. Vivian had built my napkin sketch into a living, breathing structure. Every detail preserved. Every angle honored. But she had done more than simply replicate my drawing. She had elevated it. The fieldstone was local Mackinaw limestone, quarried from the same cliffs the house stood upon, giving it the appearance of having grown from the earth rather than been placed upon it. The timber framing was white oak, hand-adzed in a style that hadn't been common since the 1880s. The windows were original Victorian arches, their glass carrying the slight waviness of age. She spent 33 summers building this, Theo said quietly from the driver's seat. Every year when she told the family she was attending a design conference in Montreal, she came here instead, supervised every stone, chose every beam. He paused. She said it had to be perfect because it was the only honest thing she could give you. I climbed down from the carriage on legs that felt like wet plaster. The limestone path to the front door was laid in a herringbone pattern I had once described to Vivian as the strongest way to distribute weight across a walkway. She had remembered that too. Every stone was a word in a conversation I didn't know we were having. The front door was red oak. I could tell by the grain even before my fingers touched the surface. Quarter-sawn, tight-ringed, finished with a hand-rubbed tongue oil that I could smell from 3 feet away. It was the same finish I used on every piece I built. My finish. My technique. She had studied me with the same precision she applied to her blueprints, and she had built this door to feel like my hand on the wood. I turned the iron key in the lock, and the door opened onto a foyer that smelled of beeswax furniture polish and the faint mineral tang of lake water carried on a draft. The floors were wide plank white oak, pegged in the traditional style with walnut dowels. My boots echoed on the wood as I stepped inside, and the sound was warm rather than hollow. This was not a museum. This was a home that had been breathing without me. The living room opened to my left, and I stopped dead at its threshold. The walls were covered in frames, hundreds of them. But they weren't holding photographs of Vivian's corporate achievements or the children's milestones. They were holding my sketches. Every napkin doodle, every envelope margin drawing, every scrap of paper I had ever absently drafted a design onto and then left on a coffee table or stuffed into a coat pocket had been collected, preserved, and mounted in archival frames behind museum glass. Some I remembered. Most I had forgotten entirely. There was the cantilevered bookshelf I had sketched on a bank deposit slip in 1991. The garden pergola drawn on the back of a grocery list in 2003. The curved staircase railing I had idly calculated on a paper placemat at a diner in 2008. Dozens more. Hundreds. Every casual thought I had ever committed to paper, rescued from the trash, from coat pockets, from the margins of newspapers, and treated with the reverence of a master's portfolio. Between the sketches hung photographs. Candid shots of me. Working. Sleeping. Reading in my study with a book splayed on my chest. Inspecting a joint with my reading glasses pushed up on my forehead. Laughing at something I couldn't remember. They spanned decades. The earliest was from 1982, a grainy shot of me on a scaffolding, 27 years old, holding a spirit level against a header beam. The most recent was from 3 months ago, taken through the study window at the penthouse. Someone had been watching me, documenting me, even in my loneliest moments. She curated this room herself, Theo said from the doorway, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. Every visit. 33 years of collecting the pieces of you that you kept throwing away. I moved deeper into the house, each room revealing another chapter. The kitchen was designed around a central island, made from a single slab of live-edge walnut. I recognized the species, the specific amber tone of black walnut heartwood that I had once told Vivian was the most honest wood in North America. The dining room table was built from reclaimed barn oak, its surface still showing the ghost of old square nail holes. The library held my favorite authors arranged on shelves with the exact spacing I preferred. 15 inches between shelf centers. the specific measurement I had mentioned once in passing 20 years ago. This house didn't just look like my design. It was built for me. Every room calibrated to my preferences, my measurements, my taste. It was a love letter written in stone and timber and glass, composed over 33 years by a woman who had spent those same years pretending she didn't love me at all. Theo appeared beside me holding a leather folder. Inside was a deed. The property had been registered in my name since 1982. I had been the legal owner of this estate for 41 years without ever knowing it. The house predated the children's trust structures by years. It existed entirely outside the Hargrove estate. Untouchable, invisible, mine. How do you reconcile the woman who called you manual labor in her will with the woman who spent 33 years building a stone cathedral to your existence? I was still holding the deed when Theo reached into his apron pocket and produced a second key. Smaller than the iron one. Silver. Polished to a mirror shine and cold against my palm. "The third floor is between her and you," he said, his raspy voice dropping to something that approached reverence. "In 33 years, I have never been allowed up those stairs." She said that room was the one place in the world where she didn't have to pretend. I looked at the silver key, then up the staircase that curved toward the upper floors. Whatever waited above those steps, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that it would change the man I thought I was. The question was whether I was ready to meet the stranger waiting on the other side of that lock. The staircase creaked beneath my boots with the familiar grounding sound of aged white oak settling under weight. Each step was a voice, low and patient, telling me that this wood had been waiting decades for exactly these footsteps. I passed the second-floor landing without stopping. Whatever those rooms contained could wait. The silver key in my hand pulled me upward like a compass needle locked on true north. The door at the top of the third-floor stairs was different from every other door in the house. It wasn't red oak or walnut or any of the warm-toned hardwoods that filled the lower levels. It was black ironwood, dense and heavy, with a grain so tight it looked almost like stone. I pressed my palm flat against its surface and felt the cold solidity of something designed to protect rather than welcome. This door wasn't an invitation. It was a vault. The silver key slid into the lock with a whispered click, and the door swung inward on silent hinges. The smell reached me before the sight did. Paper. Old paper. The specific dry vanilla scent of aging cotton fiber mixed with something else. Ink. Fountain pen ink. The kind Vivian used for her personal correspondence. Slightly metallic, with an undertone of iron gall. And then I saw them. 3 walls. Floor to ceiling. Hundreds of envelopes arranged in columns and rows with the clinical precision of an architect's filing system. Each one was cream-colored, heavy stock, sealed with burgundy wax, and labeled on the front in Vivian's unmistakable cursive. The labels were dates, month and year, starting from the left wall with July 1985 and continuing in unbroken sequence to the right wall, where the final envelope read March 2023. The month she died. 396 letters. 1 for every month of 33 years. The room itself was unlike anything else in the house. There were no electric lights, no outlets, no switches. Instead, iron candelabras stood at intervals along the walls, their holders filled with beeswax tapers that had never been lit. Moonlight entered through a single arched window that faced east across the lake. And I understood with a jolt that Vivian had designed this room to exist outside of modern time. No electricity meant no digital record, no Wi-Fi signal, no vulnerability to the surveillance systems that her children might access. This room was a bunker, disguised as a chapel. Against the far wall stood a writing desk positioned before the arched window. Its surface was bare except for a single envelope that lay at its center, like an offering on an altar. The envelope was thicker than the others, heavier, and across its face, in letters larger than the date labels, Vivian had written 2 words in her steady architect's hand. Read first. I sat in the desk chair, The leather was cold, unworn by use. This chair had only ever held one person, and she was gone. I broke the wax seal with my thumb, the brittle burgundy shell snapping with a sound that echoed in the candleless dark. As the paper unfolded, a scent rose from the pages that buckled my chest. Vivian's perfume. Not the expensive corporate fragrance she wore in Chicago. Something older, warmer, beeswax and cedar pencil shavings. The perfume of the woman she was before the performance began. Her handwriting was precise and unhurried. Each letter formed with the drafting discipline of someone who drew buildings for a living. But beneath the control, I could feel a tremor, a barely contained pressure that turned certain words slightly darker where the pen had pressed too hard. The letter didn't begin with an apology. It began with a date. June 14th, 1985, she wrote. The night the woman you married died, so that a stranger could take her place and keep you breathing, I read. And the world I thought I knew collapsed into sawdust. She described that night with a specificity that made me feel the hallway carpet beneath her bare feet, smell the rain on her wool coat, hear the grandfather clock ticking in the darkness. It was a Tuesday. The children were upstairs, supposedly asleep. Vivian had returned late from a board meeting and was walking toward the kitchen for water when she heard voices from behind the closed door of the study. Her father's voice, her mother's, and Garrett's, 16 years old, but already carrying the hard, calculating edge that I had mistaken for ambition. They were discussing me the way engineers discuss an obsolete component in a system upgrade. The word they kept using was facility, a place called Rolling Hills. Not a retirement community, a locked psychiatric ward designed to warehouse inconvenient relatives under manufactured dementia diagnoses. Her father had already contacted the intake director. Her mother had sourced a compliant psychiatrist willing to sign the commitment papers. And Garrett, my 16-year-old stepson, was enthusiastically discussing how to alter my morning coffee to accelerate the symptoms of cognitive decline. Vivian described gripping the hallway railing until her knuckles turned white. She stood there for 11 minutes. She counted. 11 minutes of listening to her own parents teach her children how to bury a man alive. I realized in that hallway, she wrote, that if I defended you openly, they would simply accelerate the timeline. If they knew I loved you, they would use that love as the map to your destruction. The only way to protect the structure was to convince the termites that the wood was already dead. She made her decision standing in that dark hallway at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in June of 1985. She would become the coldest woman in Chicago. She would treat me with a public indifference so convincing that her children would believe I was beneath their notice. She would strip me of status, of partnership, of visible affection. She would make me a ghost in my own home. To save the man who drew me a cathedral on a napkin, she wrote. The ink slightly smudged where moisture had once fallen on the page. I had to become the coldest building in Chicago. I made you invisible so they would stop trying to demolish you. I sat in the dark room with the letter trembling in my grip. 33 years. Every missed birthday. Every cold glance. Every time she had spoken to me as though I were hired help in front of the children. Every night, I had lain awake, wondering what I had done wrong, what flaw in my construction had driven her away. All of it. Every single moment of pain had been a calculated act of protection, a performance so complete that it had broken both of us. The final paragraph of the first page directed me downward, to the basement, to a safe she described as holding what they did. The letters on these walls, she explained, held what I did. Together, they formed the complete blueprint. But first, the letter ended, her handwriting growing slightly unsteady for the first and only time. You must decide if you can forgive the architect who drew you a prison to keep you alive. The basement holds justice. These walls hold love, and the choice of which door to open first will tell you everything about the man you have become in my absence. I trust you, Walt. I have always trusted you. Even when my silence made you believe otherwise. I folded the letter with hands that could no longer pretend to be steady. 395 more waited on the walls around me. 33 years of monthly confessions, apologies, and love letters I was never meant to read until the wolves had finally shown their teeth and I had found my way to this island. But it wasn't the letters that pulled me to my feet. It was the basement. The safe. The evidence of what my stepchildren had done while their mother stood between me and the dark, with nothing but her silence and a performance that cost her everything. I pocketed the silver key and descended the stairs toward the truth. The basement stairs were raw, quarried stone, cold through the soles of my boots, descending into air that smelled of mineral dampness and iron. The walls sweated slightly in the underground humidity. It felt like walking into the foundation of the earth itself. At the corridor's end stood a steel door with a mechanical combination lock. No electronics. No digital vulnerability. Just brass tumblers and human memory. I entered our wedding date without thinking. October 7th, 1979. The tumblers aligned with 3 heavy clicks, and the door exhaled its seal. Inside was a modest room. A mahogany desk beneath a single lamp. Against the far wall, industrial shelving held rows of folders arranged chronologically. They were color-coded. Blue spines for the early years, yellow for the middle period, and red. Bright arterial red for the folders beginning in 2008. A sealed envelope on the desk held a second letter from Vivian. This was not the voice of a wife. This was a prosecutor's closing argument. These folders contain the evidence of every attempt your stepchildren made on your life, she wrote. I documented everything. I could not stop them without revealing my hand. So I intercepted them. Every attempt they made, I countered with a quieter intervention designed to reduce the damage. They believed their plans were failing, due to bad luck. In truth, their failures were engineered by the same woman they thought was their ally. She explained the color system with clinical precision. From 85 to 2007, the children's schemes were psychological and financial. Gaslighting, isolation, small cruelties designed to erode my confidence. The blue and yellow folders documented these lesser attacks. But in 2008, they graduated from paper to physical harm. The red folders are their attempted murders, she wrote. Open them in order. And forgive me for what you are about to see. I pulled the first red folder from the shelf. Its label read, 2008. The scaffolding. Inside was a USB drive, a printed timeline, and 3 photographs that drained the blood from my face. The first showed a scaffolding system at a residential renovation on Dearborn Street. My site. The second was a close-up of 3 horizontal support bars, the cuts clearly visible. Clean, deliberate, made with a reciprocating saw at intervals designed to fail under sustained load. The third photograph showed a man in dark clothing crouching beside the scaffolding at 2:14 in the morning. His face was unmistakable in the infrared light. Jensen. The memory hit with the force of a falling beam. August 12th, 2008. I had arrived at the Dearborn site early and begun climbing the scaffolding to inspect the 4th-floor header. 3rd level. My boot hit the crossbar and felt the sickening lateral slide. The bar buckled. My hands grabbed air, and I was falling. The clang of collapsing aluminum. The wet crack of my left fibula snapping against the 2nd-level platform. 2 broken ribs meeting a steel connector, and Vivian appearing at the hospital 6 hours later with the expression of a woman assessing structural damage on a condemned building. You're getting clumsy, Walter, she had said at the foot of my bed. Perhaps this trade is too demanding for a man your age. I spent 8 weeks in a cast. She never once held my hand, but the folder revealed what her coldness had hidden. Vivian's notes showed she had discovered Jensen's sabotage 48 hours before my accident. The security camera she had privately installed captured him making the cuts. She faced an impossible choice. Warn me. And Jensen would know his surveillance was compromised, pivoting to a method she couldn't intercept. or let the trap proceed while controlling the damage. Her notes documented a midnight visit to the site. She replaced 2 of the 3 cut bars, repositioning them so the scaffolding would fail at the 2nd level rather than the 4th. A 2-story fall instead of 4. Broken bones instead of a broken neck. I chose your pain over your death, her note read. And I have never forgiven myself for the sound you made when you hit that platform. Have you ever discovered that the person you thought abandoned you in your darkest moment was actually the only one controlling how deep the darkness went? I closed the folder with hands shaking so violently that the photographs rattled. Jensen, the boy I taught to use a circular saw at 12. The teenager I built a workbench for so he could assemble model airplanes. He had used the knowledge I gave him to build my coffin, and Vivian had stood in that hospital room, watching me suffer, knowing she had chosen which bones would break, carrying that knowledge like a millstone for 15 years without ever being allowed to explain. I looked at the next folder on the shelf. Its spine was a darker red than the first. A small plastic evidence bag was stapled to its cover, containing a substance I recognized instantly from 30 years in the building trade. White. Fibrous. Almost weightless. The silent killer of more tradesmen than any fall from any height. Asbestos. And the handwriting on the folder's label was not a date. It was a name. Margot. I peeled open the evidence bag with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. The asbestos fibers inside were white and impossibly fine, catching the overhead light like threads of frozen spider silk. 30 years in the construction trade had taught me to fear this substance more than electricity, more than height, more than any power tool ever built. Asbestos doesn't kill you the day you breathe it. It waits. It embeds itself in the lining of your lungs like seeds planted in wet soil. And 20 years later, it blooms into a cancer that drowns you from the inside. Margot's folder contained photographs taken by a hidden camera in the penthouse utility closet. Infrared stills, time-stamped between November 2011 and May 2013, 18 months. In every image, the same figure appeared. Margot, my youngest stepdaughter, kneeling before the HVAC access panel in the hallway outside my bedroom at hours that ranged from 1 to 3 in the morning. Her face was always composed, focused, the expression of someone performing routine maintenance rather than slow-motion murder. She had been inserting asbestos-contaminated filters into the ventilation system that fed directly into my bedroom. Every breath I took while sleeping for 18 months was laced with microscopic fibers designed to shred my lungs from within. The insidious genius of it made my stomach turn. It would have looked natural. An old carpenter, developing mesothelioma. The trade that killed him, everyone would say. How tragic. How expected. But Vivian's counter-documentation told the other half of the story. A separate set of photographs, same camera, same utility closet, showed a second figure appearing every single week at 3 in the morning. Vivian, on her knees, before the same panel, removing Margot's contaminated filters and replacing them with clean ones she had purchased through an offshore medical supply company that couldn't be traced to the family accounts. 78 weeks, 78 filters. One woman in the dark with a screwdriver and a prayer. Her handwritten note read, I watched my youngest daughter try to turn your lungs into glass, Walt, and 78 times I chose you. I tried to imagine it. Vivian at 63, 64 years old, setting a silent alarm for 3 in the morning every single week, creeping through her own home like a burglar, kneeling on a cold tile floor with aching joints to undo the work of a daughter she had raised, then climbing back into bed beside me, knowing that the man next to her had no idea he was a target, no idea she was his only shield. Have you ever hated someone for their silence? Only to discover that their silence was the only sound standing between you and a grave. I placed Margot's folder on the desk and reached for the next one. Yellow label this time. 2014. Nadia's name in Vivian's precise lettering. Inside were financial documents, wire transfer receipts, and 7 high-resolution scans of architectural sketches I recognized as intimately as my own handwriting. Because they were my handwriting. Nadia had stolen 7 of my original napkin sketches from the penthouse study and sold them to Whitfield and Associates, Hargrove Design Group's primary competitor, for $2.3 million. The sketches included the curved atrium design that later became Whitfield's signature residential tower on Michigan Avenue and the cantilevered balcony system that won them an industry award in 2016. My designs, built by strangers, profited on by my own stepdaughter. Vivian's intervention was surgical. Within 6 months of discovering the theft, she had retained a discreet intellectual property attorney who registered copyright protection for every sketch I had ever produced. All under my name, all backdated to their original creation dates, using the photographic evidence from the living room upstairs. She hadn't just recovered my stolen work. She had built a legal fortress around every idle drawing I had ever committed to paper. The 2016 folder belonged to Garrett. Inside was a manila envelope containing 2 CT scan images of a human brain. They looked identical to my untrained eye, but a radiologist's report clipped to the second image told the real story. Scan A was genuine, taken during my annual physical in March of that year. Scan B was a digital alteration of the same image, with artificial markers added to simulate early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Garrett had paid a corrupt technician at Northwestern Medical to fabricate evidence of my cognitive decline. The purpose was clear from the legal documents stapled beneath. Garrett had been building a case for conservatorship, a legal declaration that I was mentally incompetent, giving him power of attorney over my affairs and effectively allowing the children to do anything they wanted with me, including commitment to a facility. The same strategy his grandparents had proposed 30 years earlier, now dressed in medical language rather than whispered cruelty. Vivian's countermove was equally precise. She had arranged for a second, independent CT scan at a private clinic under an assumed patient name. The genuine results, showing a perfectly healthy 70-year-old brain, were sealed in an envelope with a notarized chain of custody document that made the fabrication legally indefensible. 3 children, 3 methods: poison, theft, fraud. A coordinated campaign spanning 8 years, each attack designed to look like misfortune or aging, or the natural decline of an old tradesman past his prime. And behind every single attempt, invisible and silent, Vivian had been working, countering, documenting, saving my life in ways I could never see because seeing would have ended the only protection I had. I reached the final section of the shelf. The folder here was thicker than all the others combined. Its spine was the darkest red on the shelf, almost black, and it bore a label that made my throat constrict. 2019. The trial they never won. I opened it and found, clipped to the first page, a photograph that shattered something inside my chest. Vivian, lying in a hospital bed at Northwestern Memorial, her body so diminished by stage 4 pancreatic cancer that I barely recognized the woman I had loved for 44 years. Her cheekbones pressed against paper-thin skin. Her arms were threaded with IV lines, but her eyes burned with a fire that made the fluorescent hospital light look cold by comparison. In her hand, she held a fountain pen poised above a legal document so thick it required a separate binder clip, and on her face was an expression I had never seen in 33 years of living beside her cold performance. It was triumph. The photograph of Vivian in that hospital bed was taken on October 3, 2019. I know because the date was visible on the whiteboard behind her head, alongside her medication schedule and a set of vitals that told me her body was failing even as her mind burned at full intensity. Stage 4. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't negotiate. The kind that gives you a number of months and dares you to use them. She had used every single one. The 2019 folder contained the transcript of a conservatorship hearing. Garrett had filed the petition in September, using the fabricated CT scan, a collection of testimony from household staff he had bribed, and a sworn statement from Jensen claiming he had personally witnessed me wandering the penthouse at night in a state of confusion. The petition described me as a danger to myself, a man whose cognitive decline had accelerated to the point where institutional care was the only humane option. I read the transcript and felt my jaw clench so hard that my back teeth ached. Every word was a lie built on a foundation of earlier lies, each one load-bearing, each one designed to make me disappear into a system that would never let me out. But Vivian had not spent 33 years building a fortress, only to let them breach the walls in her final months. From her hospital bed, tethered to morphine drips and chemotherapy that was buying her weeks rather than years, she had given a sealed deposition to the presiding judge. The transcript of her testimony ran 47 pages. She provided everything: the scaffolding video, the asbestos photographs, the original versus fabricated CT scans, financial records showing payments to the corrupt technician, wire transfers proving Nadia's sale of my intellectual property, a complete forensic accounting of every dollar the children had spent attempting to destroy me. My husband is the most structurally sound mind in this family, she had testified, her voice transcribed with notations indicating long pauses for breath and pain medication adjustments. My children are the ones with the rot in their foundations. I ask this court to dismiss their petition and investigate their conduct. The judge dismissed the case in a sealed hearing. The trust accounts were frozen pending an ethics review, and Garrett's conservatorship petition became the trigger for a legal mechanism Vivian had designed years earlier. By proving attempted fraud, she activated an automatic audit clause buried deep in the trust bylaws. The children would never be able to access their inheritance without clearing a conduct review that would take years and cost them everything they had. She had left them the money, but she had taken away their hands. I turned the page and found the revelation that made the room tilt beneath me. Clipped to the final section of the folder was a thick stack of documents, bound with a brass fastener. 47 certificates of copyright registration, filed with the United States Copyright Office between 1985 and 2019. Each one bore my name as the sole creator. Each one was accompanied by photographic evidence of the original sketch, dated and notarized. 47 napkin drawings, 47 copyrights. And as I read through the list of registered works, I began to recognize them, not as my idle doodles, but as buildings. Real buildings, standing buildings. The curved atrium of the lakeside residential tower, the cantilevered terrace system of the Millennium Cultural Center, the roofline geometry of the North Shore Library. 12 of Chicago's most celebrated architectural achievements of the last 3 decades, all designed by Hargrove Design Group, all credited to Vivian's genius. All of them mine. Every single one had originated as a sketch I drew on a napkin, a receipt, a grocery list margin, a paper placemat. Vivian had taken my casual thoughts and developed them into finished architectural plans with her technical expertise and engineering precision. But the original concepts, the creative DNA of every building, belonged to me, and she had known it. She had documented it, and she had ensured that legally, irrefutably, the intellectual property remained in my name. The $18 million the children had inherited wasn't wealth. It was debt. Vivian had spent her final years systematically over-leveraging the company's assets, pulling equity out of properties, and loading the corporate trusts with high-interest obligations that would mature within months of her death. The children hadn't inherited an empire. They had inherited a controlled demolition. And I, the carpenter they had dismissed, the manual labor they had thrown away, I was the legal owner of the intellectual property that every dollar of their supposed fortune was built upon. They didn't owe me respect. They owed me $6 million in unpaid licensing fees. A video file sat at the bottom of the folder. I inserted the USB drive into the laptop on the desk, and suddenly Vivian was there. Not the cold matriarch. Not the dying patient. The woman I married. Her hospital gown hung loose on her diminished frame, but her voice was steady as poured concrete. They will inherit my debt, Not my wealth, she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that belonged to a general rather than a patient. And you, my love, will inherit the only thing that was ever truly yours. Your genius. 47 napkins. 47 copyrights. 47 buildings that exist because a carpenter sat down at a dinner table and dreamed on paper. She paused, drew a careful breath. Be free, Walt. I have built the walls, but you are the one who decides who gets to walk through the gate. Use the key when they come. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. And they will come. I sat in the blue glow of the frozen video, her face still filling the screen, when a sharp electronic chime cut through the silence of the basement. The security panel on the wall flashed amber. I crossed the room and read the alert on the small monitor. 4 passengers. Mackinac City Ferry Terminal. Boarding the next departure to Mackinac Island. Names flagged. Hargrove, G. Hargrove, N. Hargrove, J. Hargrove, M. C. The wolves had smelled blood, and they were already at the water's edge. I moved with a calm I hadn't possessed in 44 years. The panic that had driven me through the night from Chicago, the paranoia of the sedan on the highway, the grief that had buckled my knees in the third-floor room, all of it had burned away in the blue light of Vivian's video. What remained was something older, harder. The same quiet focus I used to feel when approaching a suspect beam in a condemned structure. You don't rush a structural inspection. You observe. You measure. You wait for the wood to tell you where it's going to break. I climbed the basement stairs and crossed into the study where Vivian's security command console occupied a recessed alcove behind a hinged bookshelf. The system was elegant in its simplicity. 6 cameras covering the property perimeter. Motion sensors along the driveway. An encrypted satellite uplink that fed directly to a legal server maintained by a firm in Grand Rapids that Vivian had retained under a corporate shell name. Every image captured on this property was automatically timestamped, encrypted, and stored in a jurisdiction that the Hargrove family attorneys couldn't touch. I activated the live stream protocol. From this moment forward, every word spoken within range of the house cameras would constitute an admissible legal deposition. The children wouldn't know they were being recorded. They would walk into this house believing they were confronting a helpless old carpenter, and they would walk out having testified against themselves. I gathered the folders from the basement, the scaffolding photographs, the asbestos evidence, the CT scan comparison, the copyright registrations, the financial audit showing the over-leveraged trusts. I carried them upstairs and arranged them on the dining room table in chronological order. Each one positioned like a card in a hand I had spent 33 years being dealt without knowing it. Then I did something that surprised even me. I brewed a pot of peppermint tea, poured a single cup, and carried it to the wraparound porch. I placed it on the small table beside Vivian's wicker chair, along with the black USB drive containing every piece of evidence compiled across 3 decades. And I sat down. The afternoon sun hit the limestone cliffs below, turning the lake surface into hammered silver. A pair of loons called somewhere in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a question without an answer. I sipped my tea and waited for my children to arrive. Theo's voice crackled through the intercom mounted beside the front door. "They're at the terminal," he reported. "Hired a locksmith from the village. My nephew Eli." A dry laugh. "The boys already texted me their entire plan. They've got a forged deed in a document tube. Think they're going to change the locks on you. Let them come," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Steady. Low. The voice of a man who owned every inch of the ground beneath him. "The locks don't matter when you hold the key to the whole house." 20 minutes passed. I heard them before I saw them. The clatter of a horse-drawn carriage on gravel. The sharp, frustrated voices of people accustomed to climate-controlled luxury being subjected to 3 miles of unpaved island road without the insulation of a German sedan. When the carriage rounded the final bend and the house came into view, I watched the transformation happen in real time. They had expected a ruin, a shack, the kind of crumbling island cottage that would justify their narrative of a senile old man living in squalor. Instead, they saw a 3-story Victorian masterpiece on a cliff edge, maintained with a precision that made their Lakeshore Drive penthouse look like a prefabricated box. The confusion on their faces curdled rapidly into something more dangerous. Fresh greed. Garrett stepped down first. His Italian loafers, designed for boardroom carpet, sank into the soft earth. His suit was wrinkled from the journey, his hair disheveled by the lake wind, and mud already climbing the hem of his trousers. He looked less like a venture capitalist and more like a man who had been dragged behind the horse rather than carried by it. He clutched a heavy cardboard document tube against his chest like a scepter. Behind him, Nadia emerged with mascara streaked by wind-drawn tears, followed by Jensen, who was visibly sweating despite the autumn chill, and finally Margot, who gripped her phone as though it were a life preserver, not yet realizing that cell service on Mackinac Island was as scarce as the motor vehicles. They stood at the base of the porch steps. 4 people in designer clothing ruined by mud and horse sweat and 3 miles of humility. They looked up at me the way they had always looked at me, as something beneath them, something to be removed. "You've had your little vacation, Walt," Garrett barked, planting one mud-caked loafer on the bottom step. He raised the document tube like a weapon. "This property is part of the Hargrove estate. We have a revised deed showing maternal ownership. Pack your toolbox and get off our land." Nadia added her voice, sharp and practiced. "Look at him, sitting there like some kind of island king. It's pathetic." Jensen shifted his weight from foot to foot, his gambler's eyes scanning the property with the rapid calculation of a man already mentally subdividing it into sellable lots. Only Margot hung back, her gaze lingering on the porch railing with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was looking at the woodwork, at the joints, at the specific craftsmanship that she perhaps recognized from decades of watching me work. I didn't stand up. I didn't respond to Garrett's demand or Nadia's insult. I lifted the black USB drive from the table beside my tea and held it between my thumb and forefinger, turning it slowly in the afternoon light. A small black rectangle, lighter than a carpenter's pencil, heavier than everything they had ever built. Garrett's foot froze on the second step. His eyes locked onto the drive, and I watched the exact moment his confidence fractured. He didn't know what was on it, but something in the way I held it, the absolute stillness of a man who had spent his life measuring the precise moment before a structure gives way, told him that the ground beneath his expensive shoes had just turned to sand. Have you ever seen a man who believed he was the predator realize, in a single frozen heartbeat, that he had walked willingly into the kill box? I took one final sip of my tea, set the cup down with a soft ceramic click, and spoke the first words I had directed at my stepchildren since Pemberton's office. "Inside. All of you." They filed through the front door like prisoners entering a courtroom. The shift happened the moment they crossed the threshold and saw the hallway walls. Hundreds of framed sketches, decades of photographs, their mother's lifelong devotion to the man they had tried to erase, displayed with museum-quality precision in a house they never knew existed. Nadia was the first to break the silence. "How long has she been hiding this?" she whispered, her composure cracking as her eyes swept across the gallery of my life. I didn't answer. I walked ahead of them through the living room, past the kitchen with its live-edge walnut island, past the library with its perfectly spaced shelves, and down the stone staircase into the basement. They followed. They had no choice. The gravity of what they were beginning to understand pulled them downward as surely as it pulled me. The basement room was exactly as I had left it. Folders arranged on the desk, laptop open, the overhead lamp casting its single cone of warm light onto 33 years of documented betrayal. I sat behind the mahogany desk, the leather chair settling beneath me with a familiar creak, and gestured to the 4 empty chairs I had positioned on the opposite side. They sat. Garrett still clutched his useless document tube. Nadia gripped the arms of her chair. Jensen's leg bounced in its ceaseless rhythm. Margot stared at the red-spined folders on the shelves, with an expression that told me she already knew what color her name was filed under. "You thought the penthouse was the inheritance," I said, my voice low and level. "These folders are your real legacy." I began with Jensen. I turned the laptop screen toward them and pressed play on the scaffolding video. The infrared footage was grainy, but unmistakable. Jensen, 35 years old, crouching beside my worksite at 2 in the morning, with a reciprocating saw. The sound of the saw's motor was tinny through the laptop speakers, but Jensen's face drained of all color, as though the blade were cutting into him instead of steel. "Is that?" Nadia started. 2008. I confirmed. Dearborn Street. He cut 3 support bars. I fell 2 stories. Broke my leg and 2 ribs. I paused. Your mother replaced 2 of the bars the night before. I was supposed to fall 4 stories. She chose which bones I would break. Jensen's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. His bouncing leg had gone perfectly still. I moved to Margot. I laid the asbestos photographs on the desk, fanning them out like a hand of cards. 18 months of infrared stills showing her kneeling before the HVAC panel in the dark. Asbestos filters. I said. 18 months in my bedroom ventilation. Your mother replaced them every single week at 3 in the morning for 78 weeks straight. Margot made a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. Small. Involuntary. Her eyes fixed on the photographs with the horror of someone seeing their own reflection in a crime scene. I turned to Nadia. The copyright documents. The wire transfers to Whitfield and Associates. 7 of my original sketches. Sold for $2.3 million to your mother's competitor. My intellectual property. My designs. Stolen from my study and monetized without my knowledge. Nadia's practiced composure shattered. She pressed both hands flat against the desk, as though trying to keep the room from spinning. "Those were just doodles," she said, her voice thin and defensive. "They were on napkins. They were worth 47 copyrights." I cut her off. "Registered in my name since 1985. Every major building your mother's firm ever designed originated from one of my sketches. Every one." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the lake water lapping against the cliffs 200 feet below us. Finally, I turned to Garrett. The fabricated CT scan. The conservatorship petition. The bribed technician at Northwestern. I laid each document before him with the unhurried precision of a carpenter fitting a mortise joint. He didn't look at the papers. He looked at me. And for the first time in 44 years, I saw fear in his eyes. "The $18 million you inherited," I said, letting each word land with the weight of a driven nail, "is debt. Your mother spent her final years pulling every dollar of equity out of the company. The trusts are over-leveraged. The properties are mortgaged beyond their value. You didn't inherit wealth, Garrett. You inherited a controlled demolition." I placed the copyright summary on top of the pile. "Furthermore, as the registered owner of every foundational design that Hargrove Design Group ever built upon, you collectively owe me $6 million in unpaid intellectual property licensing fees. You are not my heirs. You are my debtors." Have you ever watched 4 people discover simultaneously that the empire they fought to steal was actually a bomb, and they had just pulled the pin? Garrett's document tube hit the floor with a hollow plastic sound. The forged deed inside was worthless. The property had been mine since '82. The Conservation Trust designation meant it could never be sold or developed regardless of who held the title. Every weapon they had brought to this island was made of cardboard. I slid 4 copies of a document across the desk. Identical contracts, printed on heavy legal stock. The terms were non-negotiable. Garrett would surrender himself for a prearranged 4-year sentence at Stateville Correctional for the brake line equivalent of the scaffolding sabotage, serving as a paralegal for indigent inmates. Jensen, Nadia, and Margot would remain on the island, working the construction site and workshop at $22 an hour under supervised labor. Any deviation, any sign of the old greed, and the evidence would be automatically released to the Cook County District Attorney. "You're a monster, Walt," Garrett whispered, his hand trembling as he picked up the pen. I met his gaze with the stillness of a man who had measured 10,000 beams and never once found one stronger than the truth. "No, Garrett," I said. "I'm just the carpenter. And your foundation just failed." The pen scratched against paper. One signature, then two, then three, then four. Each one the sound of a life being dismantled and rebuilt from the studs. As they sat in the silence of their new reality, I added one final thing. "Your mother didn't leave me a key to escape," I said. "She left me a key to bring you home. The question is whether you'll recognize home when you're standing in it." Garrett left the island at dawn. I watched from the porch as two federal marshals escorted him down the gravel drive to a waiting carriage. He wore the same mud-stained suit from the day before, having refused the work clothes I had offered. His back was rigid, his jaw locked in that familiar clench of inherited pride. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look at his siblings who stood on the lawn in the gray morning light like mourners at their own funeral. The carriage disappeared into the tree line, and the sound of hooves on gravel faded until the only thing left was the wind off Lake Huron and the breathing of three people who had just watched their leader carried away. "Your assignments begin today," I said from the porch railing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Jensen. Foundation. Work on the new workshop wing. Report to Foreman Eli at the construction site by 7. Nadia. Basic joinery in the woodshop. Theo will instruct you. Margot. Greenhouse maintenance and meal preparation for the work crew. $22 an hour. Logged daily. Any absence is reported directly to the parole board overseeing Garrett's case. Jensen spat on the ground. "You can't seriously expect me to dig ditches. I expect you to lay foundations," I replied. "The same thing I've done every day for 50 years. The difference is that when I did it, nobody was trying to kill me from above." He flinched, but he walked toward the site. They all did. They had no choice. The alternative was a courtroom, and the kind of sentences that would make Garrett's 4 years look like a vacation. The first week was warfare. Quiet, grinding, petty warfare, fought with drop tools and slammed doors, and the kind of seething silence that makes a house feel like a pressure cooker. Jensen refused to speak to anyone on the crew. Nadia lasted exactly 40 minutes at the workbench before throwing a chisel across the shop hard enough to chip the stone wall. Margot burned 3 consecutive meals and left the greenhouse heating system off overnight, killing a flat of winter seedlings. I said nothing. I observed. I let the cold do its work. November arrived with the first real teeth of a Mackinac winter. The lake wind turned from a whisper to a blade, cutting through the island's remaining warmth and turning the construction site into a frozen trench of iron-hard earth. Jensen's hands cracked and bled within the first hour of digging each morning. Nadia's fingers turned white at the tips as she struggled to grip the handplane Theo had assigned her. Even inside the greenhouse, Margot could see her own breath. It was during the second week of November that I found the whiskey. A bottle of 18-year Macallan, smuggled onto the island in Jensen's duffel bag, hidden behind a loose floorboard in his cottage. I didn't announce my discovery. I didn't lecture. I waited until Jensen was watching from across the yard. Then I walked to the center of the snow-covered lawn and upended the bottle. The amber liquid hit the white ground and froze almost instantly, a golden stain spreading across the snow like a bruise. Jensen stood at the doorway of his cottage, his breath rising in clouds, his cracked hands curled into fists at his sides. I met his eyes across the distance and said one thing. "Pain is just wood telling you it's being shaped, Jensen. Keep sanding." He didn't speak. He turned and walked back inside. But the next morning, he was at the site 15 minutes early. His jaw set, his bleeding hands wrapped in cloth tape, driving a pickaxe into the frozen ground with a fury that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the man he was trying to stop being. The blizzard hit on the last night of November. Wind off the lake at 40 miles per hour. Snow falling so thick and horizontal that the world beyond the window glass ceased to exist. I was in the main house reading one of Vivian's monthly letters, the 1992 installment where she described Christmas morning and how badly she wanted to hold my hand in front of the tree. The power held in the house, backed by the generator Vivian had installed years ago. But across the yard, the workshop was on a separate circuit, and its heating system had just died. I saw the light go out in the shop from my study window, heard the distant bang of Theo's emergency bell. By the time I pulled on my coat and reached the yard, Jensen and Nadia were already there. Not because I had told them to go, because they heard the bell and they went. I stood in the doorway and watched them work. Jensen held a flashlight in his teeth while Nadia fed split logs into the backup wood stove. Her hands shaking badly, but moving with a determination I had never seen from her before. The cast iron door of the stove clanged shut, and Jensen adjusted the flue with fingers that were turning blue. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time in their lives, they were cooperating not for profit, not for advantage, but because the cold would kill them both equally if they failed. The fire caught. The orange glow spread across the workshop floor, and I saw Nadia slump against the workbench with a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Jensen sat heavily on an overturned crate, his breath gradually slowing, steam rising from his damp jacket. They looked at each other in the firelight with an expression I recognized. Not warmth, not forgiveness, but the raw, animal acknowledgement of shared survival. I left them there and walked back through the blizzard to the main house. The snow was already covering my boot prints by the time I reached the porch. I climbed the stairs to check the cottage lights and stopped at the edge of the property where the path curved toward the small memorial garden Theo had planted for Vivian beneath a stand of white birch. Someone had been there. Fresh footprints in the snow, small and deliberate, leading from Margot's cottage to the garden gate and back. The gate was unlatched, and inside, barely visible in the blowing snow, the rose bushes had been carefully wrapped in burlap against the frost. The ties were neat, precise, done with the patient hands of someone who had been awake since long before dawn. No one had asked her to do it. No one had even suggested the garden needed winterizing. She had gone alone in the dark, in the cold, at 5 in the morning, to protect the only living thing on this island that still carried her mother's name. I stood there in the snow, the wind cutting through my coat, and felt the first hairline crack in something I had been holding rigid inside my chest since the day I sat in Pemberton's office. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the recognition that somewhere beneath the rot, a living grain still ran through the wood. Spring arrived on Mackinac Island, not with warmth but with sound. The crack of ice breaking on the lake. The drip of snowmelt, finding its way through stone. The first tentative calls of returning birds testing the air for winter's retreat. And beneath all of it, the rhythmic percussion of hammers and handsaws from the workshop site where the skeleton of the new teaching wing was finally rising above its frozen foundation. The Hargrove Brennan Workshop opened its doors to its first class of students in the third week of April. 6 teenagers from the mainland, all referred through a vocational program for youth aging out of foster care. They arrived on the morning ferry with duffel bags and the guarded posture of people who had learned early that the world's promises were usually lies. Jensen had been assigned as a teaching assistant, not because he had earned the title, but because 5 months of digging frozen earth had given him the kind of physical credibility that teenagers respect on instinct. His hands were callous now, scarred across the knuckles from a winter of mishandled tools and stubborn stone. He no longer bounced his leg. He no longer scanned exits. The nervous energy of the gambler had been ground down into something quieter, something watchful. Tommy Oakes was 17, wiry, silent in the way that certain boys become silent when they've learned that words can be used against them. He took to the lathe with an intensity that reminded me of myself at that age, the way a piece of spinning wood can become the entire world when your hands are guiding the chisel and nothing else exists but the shape emerging from the blur. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The shop was warm with the smell of fresh-cut maple and the low hum of concentrated work. I was in the office reviewing supply orders when I heard the sound. Not a scream, a sound worse than a scream. The wet mechanical grinding of wood meeting flesh, followed by the absolute silence that only comes when a room full of people collectively stops breathing. I reached the shop floor in 4 seconds. Tommy was pinned against the planer, his right forearm caught between the feed roller and the cutting head. The machine had jammed on a knot in the board he was feeding, and instead of releasing, the rollers had grabbed his sleeve and pulled his arm into the gap. His face was white. His mouth was open in a silent oval of pure shock. Blood was already pooling beneath the machine in a dark spreading circle. Jensen was closest. And Jensen didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed I hadn't seen from him since the night of the blizzard. One hand slammed the emergency shutoff. The other grabbed the manual release lever and threw his entire body weight against it, the tendons in his neck standing out like bridge cables as he fought the mechanical resistance of the jammed rollers. The lever didn't move. Jensen repositioned, planted his boots, pulled again with a sound that came from somewhere deeper than muscle. "Don't let go, Jensen," Theo shouted from across the shop, already running with a pry bar. "If those rollers re-engage, he loses the arm." Jensen's face was a mask of effort, so complete it erased every trace of the man who had once cut scaffolding bars to kill his father. His hands were slipping on the lever, slick with Tommy's blood, his cracked knuckles splitting open again under the strain. But he held. His teeth bared. His breath, a continuous grunting exhale. He held until Theo arrived with the pry bar, and together they levered the rollers apart. Tommy's arm came free, mangled, bleeding, but attached. The boy collapsed backward into Jensen's chest, and Jensen caught him with arms that were shaking so badly they looked like they belonged to a man in a seizure. He lowered Tommy to the floor, cradling the injured arm, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur that I had never heard from him before. "You're okay. Hey, look at me. You're okay. Keep breathing. Just keep breathing." I stood in the doorway watching my stepson hold a bleeding teenager on a sawdust-covered floor, and I saw something I had waited 5 months to see. Presence. Not the jittery, calculating presence of a man running numbers. The full, grounded presence of a human being who had just chosen someone else's survival over his own comfort. The paramedics arrived by horse-drawn ambulance 20 minutes later. Tommy would keep the arm. 3 tendons severed. 6 months of physical therapy. But he would keep it. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, Tommy's father, a commercial fisherman with hands even more battered than Jensen's, crossed the yard and stopped in front of my stepson. He didn't say thank you. He extended his hand, and Jensen took it. The grip lasted 3 seconds, but I watched Jensen's face during those 3 seconds, and what I saw there was worth more than every dollar his mother's estate had ever generated. That evening, after the shop had been cleaned and the students sent home early, Jensen appeared at my workshop door. His clothes were still stained with Tommy's blood. His hands were wrapped in fresh gauze where his old calluses had split open. He carried a bottle of bourbon, unopened. The label was cheap, a mainland grocery store brand. He set it on my workbench with a deliberate care that told me this bottle had been his companion through many dark nights. "Tommy's father shook my hand today," he said. His voice was quiet, raw. A handshake, Walt. Not a transaction. Not a deal. Just one man thanking another for doing something real. He looked at the bottle. "That's worth more than every bet I've ever won." He turned toward the door, then stopped, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, folded small and worn at the creases from repeated handling. He placed it on the bench beside the bourbon. "Nadia wrote this 3 weeks ago," he said without looking at me. "She's been sending letters to a firm in Chicago, Whitfield and Associates. She's trying to get them to challenge the copyright registrations. If she can get the IP invalidated, She thinks the frozen trusts unlock, and the whole contract falls apart. He paused at the doorframe. I'm telling you because Tommy's father shook my hand. And I don't want to be the kind of man who accepts that handshake while keeping secrets from the man who gave me the chance to earn it. Then he was gone, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path toward his cottage, leaving me alone with an unopened bottle, a crumpled letter, and the knowledge that one of my children had just chosen the harder road. While another was still looking for shortcuts through the wall, I smoothed the paper flat under the workshop lamp, read Nadia's careful handwriting, and felt not anger, but a deep, familiar sadness. The sadness of a carpenter who discovers rot in a beam he thought was finally curing. I didn't confront Nadia with the letter. I didn't summon her to the study or lay the evidence of her betrayal on the desk the way I had done in the basement confrontation. That method had worked once because it was designed to break through walls of arrogance. But what I needed to break through now was something different. Not arrogance. Fear. The specific terror of a woman who had spent her entire life building an identity out of other people's work and was now facing the possibility that she might have nothing of her own underneath. I went to her cottage at 6 in the morning before the work bell rang. The door was unlocked. She was already awake, sitting at the small table in the gray pre-dawn light. The crumpled draft of another letter to Whitfield spread before her. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the flash of calculation cross her face. The instinct to hide the paper, to spin a story, to manage the narrative. I didn't give her time. I placed the laptop on her table, opened it, and pressed play on a video file I had found in the basement archives 3 days earlier. A file labeled with her name and a date. March 2021. 2 weeks before Vivian died. Vivian appeared on screen, gaunt, hollowed by the cancer that was consuming her from within. But her eyes were focused entirely on the camera with an intensity that made the small cottage room feel like it was shrinking. She spoke directly to her daughter with a voice that cracked at the edges but never broke. Nadia. My brilliant, frightened girl. Vivian's image leaned slightly forward. I know what you did with the sketches. I've always known. And I need you to understand something that you have spent your entire life running from. You have your father's hands, Nadia. Not the hands of a thief. The hands of a maker. You have been so terrified of being ordinary that you never once tried to discover what you could build with your own mind and your own fingers. You stole Walt's work because you believed you had nothing of your own. But you were wrong. You were always wrong. The video lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. By the end of the first minute, Nadia had stopped breathing. By the second minute, her composure had crumbled into something I had never seen on her face. Not the polished grief she performed at the funeral. Not the calculated remorse she displayed in the basement. Something raw and ugly and absolutely real. The face of a 53-year-old woman hearing her dead mother call her by her childhood name and tell her she was enough. When the video ended, the cottage was silent except for Nadia's breathing, which came in short, hitching gasps. The letter to Whitfield lay forgotten on the table. She pressed both palms flat against the wood surface, as though trying to absorb something through her skin. I don't know how to make anything, she whispered. I never learned. I just learned how to take. Then it's time to learn, I said. And I left her there, with her mother's ghost, and the first honest sentence she had spoken in 30 years. She appeared at the workshop 2 hours later. Didn't ask for special treatment. Didn't request a private lesson. She picked up the same chisel that Theo handed every beginner and stood at the same bench where the 17-year-old students practiced their first cuts. And she failed. Catastrophically. Beautifully. 16 consecutive attempts to shape a single chair leg, each one splitting or warping or simply refusing to become the shape she saw in her mind. Her hands bled. Her back ached. She cursed in languages I didn't know she spoke. But she didn't leave the bench. And on the 17th attempt, as the afternoon light turned golden through the workshop windows, the chisel finally moved with her rather than against her. The leg wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to professional quality. But it was hers. made by her hands from a piece of raw wood that had never been anyone else's. She held it up to the light and laughed. Not the social laugh I had heard at 1,000 dinner parties. A real laugh. Surprised, and breathless, and slightly wild. Have you ever watched someone discover, at 53 years old, that they are capable of creating something from nothing? That their hands, which they believed were only good for taking, could also build? 2 weeks later, I made the crossing to the mainland and drove south to Stateville Correctional Center. The buzzing of magnetic locks and the smell of industrial floor wax and stale air closed around me like a fist. I sat on a metal chair in the visiting room, separated from my eldest stepson by a scratched plexiglass partition that made his face look slightly blurred, as though he were already becoming someone different from the man I had last seen in a mud-stained suit. Garrett's hands rested flat on the counter. They were different. Calloused now. Stained with wood finish at the cuticles. He had been working in the prison carpentry shop I had learned from his case officer. Volunteered for it in his second week. Requested additional hours by his fourth. "Did she ever actually love us?" he asked without preamble. His voice was stripped of its boardroom polish. It sounded like wood that had been sanded down to bare grain. Or were we just defects she couldn't sand out? I looked at him through the scratched partition, at the new lines around his eyes, at the hands that looked, for the first time in his life, like they had built something rather than bought it. "She loved the boys you were before the greed took hold," I said. "She spent 33 years trying to find them again under all that varnish." He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that made me sit straighter in my metal chair. He had been using his legal training, the same training that once built conservatorship petitions and forged deeds, to trace the original offshore accounts that his grandparents had established decades ago to launder Vivian's bonuses. Money that had been diverted from the family trust before the children were even born. He had found it. Documented it. And he intended to return every cent to the island sanctuary fund as restitution. "I don't want to be a sterling heir anymore," he said, using the old family name like a word he was learning to spit out. "I want to be something else. I just don't know what yet." I stood to leave when the guard signaled time. Pressed my palm flat against the partition in a gesture I hadn't planned. He pressed his back against it from the other side. Not a handshake. Not a hug. But a measurement, 2 carpenters checking if the joint between them could hold weight again. I walked out through the security corridor, and at the final gate, I looked back. Garrett wasn't watching the guards or the door. He was staring at his own hands, turning them over slowly in the fluorescent light. Examining them the way I examine a beam when I'm trying to determine if the wood still has enough integrity to bear a load. It was the first time I had ever seen him inspect his own foundations, and I recognized the look. It was the same look I saw in my own mirror every morning for 44 years. The look of a man who isn't sure he's strong enough but is willing to find out. Summer settled over Mackinac Island, like a warm hand placed gently on a wound. The lake calmed. The forest thickened into a cathedral of green, and the construction site hummed with the sounds of progress rather than mere survival. The teaching wing was nearly complete, its frame standing solid against the summer sky, and the students had begun their second rotation with a confidence that made the winter months feel like a different lifetime. Margot's transformation had been the quietest of the 3. No dramatic rescue. No shattered chisel. She simply appeared at the greenhouse each morning before dawn and disappeared into the rows of seedlings with the focused silence of someone conducting a private negotiation with the earth. She rarely spoke to the others during work hours. She ate alone. She walked the property paths after dinner with her head down and her hands clasped behind her back like a penitent counting invisible rosary beads. The therapy sessions had been mandated as part of the contract. Once weekly, conducted via secure video link with a specialist from the mainland. I was permitted to observe them as part of the oversight agreement. Though I chose to sit in a corner of the room rather than at the desk, making myself as unobtrusive as possible. It was during the July session that Margot finally stopped performing. Dr. Vasquez had been patient for weeks, methodically peeling back the layers of deflection and corporate language that Margot used like armor. But on this particular afternoon, with the golden light of midsummer filling the study and the distant sound of student laughter drifting up from the workshop yard, the doctor asked a question that broke through. "Tell me about the filters, Margot. Not what you did. Tell me what it felt like to walk down that hallway at 1 in the morning knowing what you were about to install." Margot was quiet for nearly 30 seconds. I counted. Then something behind her eyes collapsed inward, like a roof beam, giving way to a weight it was never designed to carry. "Routine," she whispered. It felt like routine, like replacing a coffee filter or checking the mail. I had disconnected the act from the consequence so completely that I could do it and then go back to sleep within 10 minutes. Her voice cracked. "That's the part that horrifies me, doctor. Not that I did it. That it was easy." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward on screen. "And now? What does it feel like now, when you think about those hallways?" Margot pressed her palms against her thighs, her calloused greenhouse hands leaving smudges of soil on the rough cotton of her work trousers. "I think about my mother," she said, walking that same hallway an hour later. Every week, for 78 weeks, on her knees in the dark with a screwdriver. Undoing what I did. She looked directly at the camera. I was managing a death clock. She was stopping it. And I never knew. And F-less. And A. End. I. The session ended with a silence that felt like the space between a tree falling and the ground receiving it. After Dr. Vasquez signed off, Margot remained in the chair, her body folded forward, her elbows on her knees, staring at the rug as though it contained a map to somewhere she had lost. I stood to leave. She spoke without lifting her head. "I wasn't always this, Walt." I stopped at the door. "I remember being 10 years old, coming into your workshop in the basement of the old house on Elm Street, before the penthouse, before any of it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You were building a rocking chair for my birthday. The whole room smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and your flannel shirt. And I sat on the workbench and watched you sand the armrest for 20 minutes, without either of us saying a word. And it was the safest I have ever felt in my entire life." She finally looked up. Her eyes were red and raw and completely unguarded. "I'm not asking you to forgive me so I can leave," she said. "I'm asking because I remember what sawdust smelled like when I still had a soul. I want to smell it again, without gagging on the guilt." I looked at my youngest stepdaughter, 48 years old. Hands that had once tried to fill my lungs with glass fibers, now stained with honest soil. I didn't offer absolution. It wasn't mine to give yet. But I offered something else. "Come with me," I said. I led her down the slope to the memorial garden beneath the white birch stand. The roses she had wrapped in burlap through the winter were blooming now, their petals a deep burgundy that reminded me of Vivian's wax seals. I knelt beside the nearest bush and gestured for her to kneel beside me. "Do you know how to graft a rose?" I asked. She shook her head. I took my pocket knife and made a careful diagonal cut in the stem of the rootstock. Then I selected a scion from the neighboring bush, one of Vivian's original plantings, and trimmed it to fit. "A graft is like a second chance," I said, fitting the two pieces together with the precision of a dovetail joint. You take something damaged and you bind it to something strong. If the union holds, you get a plant that carries the strength of both. If it doesn't hold, you try again. And again, until the wood accepts its new direction. Margot watched my hands with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't expected. "A garden is just a slow-motion house, Margot," I told her as I wrapped the graft in binding tape. "Same patience, same inspection, same refusal to let the rot take hold." She took the knife from my hand, made her own cut. Imperfect. Too shallow at first. But she adjusted. Tried again. And by the end of the afternoon, we had grafted 6 new stems onto the memorial roses, working side by side in a silence that felt, for the first time, like peace rather than punishment. Over the weeks that followed, the garden became Margot's domain, in a way that went beyond her assigned duties. She researched heirloom varieties, ordered seeds from heritage catalogs, expanded the greenhouse beds to include vegetables that she served at the workshop lunches. Dishes prepared with a care that turned simple meals into small acts of nourishment. The students began requesting her tomato soup. The construction crew waited for her bread. It was the last week of August when she appeared at the workshop door carrying a wicker basket loaded with the harvest. Victoria peppers, a deep violet heirloom variety she had grown from seeds she found labeled in Vivian's greenhouse journal. Tomatoes so ripe they glowed like lanterns in the afternoon sun. She stopped at the threshold. I was inside, sharpening a plane iron, the sound of steel on stone filling the quiet space. She held the basket out toward me with both hands, her arms steady, her eyes meeting mine without deflection or performance. "Here, Dad," she said quietly. The word hung in the warm, sawdust-scented air between us. Fragile as a new graft. Tentative as the first green shoot emerging from bound wood. A word she hadn't used since 1985. Since before the letters began. Since before the woman who raised her decided that love had to wear the mask of cruelty. I set down my plane iron. Took the basket from her hands. The weight of the vegetables was nothing compared to the weight of that single word. "The peppers look strong," I said. "Your mother would have been proud of the color." She nodded. Turned. Walked back toward the greenhouse with her shoulders slightly straighter than they had been that morning. And I stood in my workshop holding a basket of purple vegetables grown by the hands that once tried to kill me. Feeling something shift in my chest that I could only describe as the sound a graft makes when it finally takes hold. Garrett came home on a Tuesday in October. I didn't plan the symmetry, but when Theo mentioned the release date, I realized that Vivian's first letter had been written on a Tuesday in June. And now, 34 years later, her eldest son was returning to the island on the same day of the week. Some patterns aren't designed. They emerge from the grain the way a figure emerges from wood that has been sanded long enough. He stepped off the ferry carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a posture I didn't recognize. Not the rigid corporate bearing I had known for 4 decades. Something looser, more grounded. His shoulders sat lower. His hands hung at his sides without clenching. The Italian loafers and bespoke suits were gone, replaced by work boots and a canvas jacket that looked like it had been chosen for durability rather than status. The only trace of the old Garrett was in his eyes, which still held a sharpness. But it was a different kind of sharp now. The sharpness of a chisel rather than a scalpel. Jensen was waiting at the dock with a horse and wagon loaded with lumber for the workshop expansion. He offered his brother a hand up onto the bench seat without ceremony or drama. They rode up the hill in silence, but it was the comfortable silence of 2 men who had separately arrived at the same place and didn't need to announce it. Nadia and Margot were standing on the porch when the wagon pulled into the yard. Margot held a mug of something hot. Nadia held nothing but clasped her hands in front of her in a way that suggested she was resisting the urge to reach toward her brother. They didn't embrace. Not yet. But the distance between them was measured in feet rather than years. And that was enough for now. I waited until evening. Until the last light of the October sun had turned the lake into hammered copper, and the house had settled into its nighttime rhythm of creaking wood and distant water. Then I gathered them on the 3rd-floor balcony, the one that faced east across Lake Huron, where the horizon was a clean, dark line between water and sky. I carried the box myself. White oak, hand-joined at the corners, with dovetails I had cut, specifically for this purpose. Inside, Vivian's ashes rested in a simple ceramic vessel, unadorned, the kind of container she would have approved of. No gold, no engraving. Just honest material shaped with honest hands. The 5 of us stood at the railing as the last color drained from the sky. I opened the box and removed the ceramic lid. The ashes inside were finer than sawdust, lighter than sanding dust. A gray so pale it was almost white. I didn't make a speech. I held the vessel out and let each of them reach inside. Their hands, all 4 of them calloused now in ways they never would have been a year ago, scooped a portion of what remained of the woman who had simultaneously broken and saved us all. Jensen was first. He held his handful over the railing and opened his fingers into the wind. "Build something new with us, Mom," he said quietly. The ashes caught the breeze and spiraled outward over the cliff edge, disappearing into the gathering dark. Margot went next. Her portion left her palm in a thin stream that the wind pulled apart like cotton. "Forgive us for the rot," she whispered. Her voice was steady. Nadia didn't speak. She simply opened her hand and watched the ashes fly, her eyes following them until they were indistinguishable from the twilight. Her jaw was set, but her cheeks were wet, and she made no move to wipe them. Garrett was last. He held his portion for a long time, the gray powder sitting in his scarred palm like a small bird. When he finally released it, he said nothing, but his lips moved in a shape I couldn't read, and I chose not to ask. I tilted the vessel and let the remaining ashes pour into the wind, a gray ribbon that unwound itself against the purple sky and dissolved into the vast breathing body of the lake. She was gone. She was everywhere. She was finally free of the performance that had cost her everything. And then my fingers touched something hard at the bottom of the box. A small envelope. Cream-colored. Salt-stained from the lake air that had seeped into the wood over the months it had waited. Tucked into the velvet lining of the compartment beneath where the vessel had rested. Hidden. Deliberately. For this specific day, Vivian's handwriting on the front was steady and clear despite the salt damage. 5 words. "For the day, you are no longer alone." I broke the seal with a thumbnail that had grown steadier over the past year. The paper inside was a single sheet. Her handwriting filled it completely, the letters smaller than usual as though she were trying to fit an entire lifetime into one page. "Walt," it began. "If you are reading this, then the children are standing beside you. And if they are standing beside you, then you have done what I always knew you could. You didn't just forgive them. You rebuilt them. That was always your gift, not drawing buildings on napkins, but seeing the structure inside broken things and knowing exactly which joints to reinforce." I felt the wind shift against my face, carrying the last traces of ash out over the water. "I love you in every silence," she wrote. "In every cold glance. In every letter I hid from the world. Forgive the architect who drew you a prison. The blueprint was always for a home." I folded the letter and pressed it against my chest. The lake stretched below us in the darkness, vast and patient. 4 people stood beside me who had once tried to end my life, and I stood among them feeling something I had not felt since the morning Vivian's heart stopped beating. Whole. Garrett's hand came to rest on my shoulder. Heavy, warm, deliberate. The weight of it was exactly right. Not tentative, not grasping. The measured pressure of a man who understood that touch, like timber, must be applied with precision or not at all. "I'd like to stay, Dad," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried no uncertainty. "Not for the trust, not for the house. I want to learn how to build something that lasts." I looked at him, at the calluses on his hands, at the new lines earned through labor rather than leverage, at the eyes that no longer calculated but simply saw. "Then we start tomorrow," I said. "Foundation first, not Hargrove, not Sterling. Brennan." Theo had filed the nonprofit papers in September. The Brennan Foundation for Applied Craft, a 501(c)(3), dedicated to teaching construction trades to foster care youth aging out of the system. The endowment came from the licensing fees, $6 million, redirected from 47 copyrights into a trust that would fund scholarships, materials, and instructor salaries for the next 40 years. The math was simple. $150,000 a year covered everything. The remainder compounded. By the time I was gone, the fund would sustain itself indefinitely. I had not touched the $18 million. I never intended to. That money sat frozen in probate, carved into restitution payments, tax liens, and civil penalties that would take the Hargrove name decades to settle. It was never mine. It was never theirs either, not really. It belonged to the architecture of greed. And architecture without a foundation always collapses. Jensen arrived at 6. He had taken to waking before dawn, a habit born from the blizzard winter, when the furnace demanded feeding every 4 hours. Now he simply could not sleep past 5. I heard his boots on the gravel path, steady and unhurried, and the creak of the workshop door opening. By the time I walked in, he had already lit the wood stove and laid out the day's lumber, 16-foot lengths of eastern white pine, freshly milled from the island's sustainable lot. 6 students were expected by 8. Jensen had written their names on the chalkboard in his careful block letters: Tommy, Aisha, Darnell, Reyes, Kwame, Suki. Tommy Oakes was back for his 2nd semester, the same boy whose arm Jensen had saved on the planer 8 months ago. The scar ran from wrist to elbow like a river on a map. But Tommy called it his diploma. He told the new students it meant he had learned something the hard way and lived to teach it. "You want me on the lathe today?" Jensen asked without looking up. "Dovetails," I said. "Aisha's been struggling with the angle." He nodded. Picked up the marking gauge. Tested its edge against his thumbnail. A gesture I recognized, because it was mine. 44 years of watching me work, and now the muscle memory had transferred like grain patterns through generations of the same species. Nadia's contribution was quieter but no less structural. She had spent the autumn building a database every napkin sketch, every margin drawing, every envelope doodle I had ever made, scanned at high resolution, and cataloged by date, location, and architectural element. 412 pieces. She called it the Brennan Archive. "It's not just preservation," she told me one evening, her laptop glowing on the kitchen table. "It's provenance. If anyone ever challenges the copyrights again, this database is the fortress wall." I watched her fingers move across the keyboard, the same fingers that once forged my signature on a sale contract to Whitfield and Associates. Now, they built walls instead of tearing them down. She had also designed the foundation's website. Clean, simple. A photograph of the workshop in morning light. The sign visible, the lake behind it. Beneath the image, a single line. Every building begins with a hand, a pencil, and the courage to draw the first line. That was Vivian's phrase. From letter 214, Nadia had found it in the archive and asked permission to use it. I said yes, without hesitation. Margot ran the kitchen now not as punishment, but as vocation. She had completed her culinary certification through an online program in October, and the foundation's meal program was her thesis project. Every student received breakfast and lunch. Whole foods, seasonal vegetables from the garden she had resurrected from Vivian's original plots. On Thursdays, she taught a supplementary class. Nourishment as architecture. The premise was simple. A meal is a structure. Protein is the foundation. Vegetables are the framing. Seasoning is the finish work. She taught 16-year-olds who had never cooked a meal from scratch how to feed themselves with dignity. I watched her one Thursday afternoon, standing before 6 teenagers with a cutting board and a chef's knife, explaining the geometry of a julienne cut. Her voice was patient. Her hands were steady. And when Darnell sliced his finger, loss of blood minimal, pride wounded significantly, she wrapped it calmly, smiled, and said, "First blood means you're trying. Second blood means you're learning. Third blood means you need a sharper knife." The students laughed. Darnell laughed loudest. Garrett wrote every week from Stateville. His letters arrived on Tuesdays. Always Tuesdays, in plain white envelopes with his inmate number stamped in the corner. The handwriting had improved. Smaller, more deliberate, less like a man demanding attention and more like a man choosing his words carefully because he understood their weight. His latest letter sat open on my desk. "Dad, I finished the certification. Industrial carpentry. The instructor said my joints were the tightest in the class. I told him I learned from letters, not lectures. He didn't believe me until I showed him the drawings you sent. 3 more years. I'll be 59 when I walk out. That's not too old to start, is it? You started the foundation at 72. I figure I've got time. I've been thinking about what you said foundation first. I think my foundation was always there. I just built on top of it, without checking if the concrete had cured. Now I'm stripping it back, layer by layer. Down to the rebar. Save me a workbench. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. 47 letters now. One for every copyright. One for every napkin. One for every building that bore his mother's name but carried my lines. The island settled into its rhythm. Ferries brought students in September and took them home in June. The workshop produced 23 graduates in its first full year, 19 of whom secured apprenticeships in construction firms across Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. 4 stayed on Mackinac to help build the foundation's second structure, a dormitory for year-round residents. I drew the plans on a napkin. Old habits. Jensen translated them into blueprints. Nadia filed the permits. Margot planned the kitchen. And Tommy Oak's scar. And all led the framing crew. On Christmas Eve, I climbed to the 3rd floor. The room was exactly as Vivian had left it, minus the letters I had already read. 396 conversations with a ghost who had loved me enough to build a fortress around my life without ever telling me. I sat in her chair, looked out at the frozen lake, and for the first time in 2 years, I did not feel the weight of the key in my pocket, because the key had done its work. Every lock it was meant to open had been opened. Every door it was meant to reveal had been walked through. What remained was not a key's purpose. What remained was a carpenter's. 3 years passed like sawdust through open fingers. I turned 75 on a Tuesday in March. No fanfare. No cake with too many candles. Jensen made breakfast, scrambled eggs with chives from the greenhouse, sourdough bread that Margot had baked at 4 in the morning, black coffee strong enough to remind me I was still alive. We ate on the porch despite the cold because that was our tradition now. And traditions on Mackinac Island were built the same way everything else was. Slowly, deliberately, with materials that could withstand weather. Garrett had been home for 11 months. Home. The word still surprised me when I used it for him, but there he was, every morning at 5:45. Crossing the gravel path from the dormitory, where he served as resident supervisor. His breath visible in the Michigan air, his hands already calloused from the previous day's work. 59 years old and built like a man who had finally stopped running from the thing he was afraid to become. He ran the advanced joinery class now. His students called him Mr. B, not Hargrove, not Sterling. Brennan. He had filed the legal name change 6 months after his release. The paperwork cost $87. He said it was the most expensive thing he had ever bought, because it was the first thing he had ever paid for, honestly. The foundation's 3rd year produced 41 graduates. The dormitory housed 12 year-round residents. The Brennan Archive, Nadia's cathedral of documentation, had been cited in 3 architectural journals and 1 intellectual property textbook. She flew to conferences now, presenting case studies on creative provenance and the legal architecture of attribution. She wore reading glasses and blazers and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what theft cost because she had once been the thief. Margot published a cookbook in February. Island Table. Seasonal meals for rebuilding. The dedication read, "For Vivian, who planted the seeds, and for Dad, who taught me that a kitchen is just a workshop with smaller tools." It sold modestly 4,000 copies in the first printing, but the reviews called it honest. And honesty was the only currency Margot traded in anymore. Jensen never left the island. I asked him once if he wanted to, if the ferry ever tempted him toward the mainland. Toward a life less structured, less watched. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The island is the right size for me. Big enough to work. Small enough to stay accountable." He had not touched alcohol in 2 years and 9 months. The workshop kept count not because I asked it to, but because Jensen himself had carved a small tally mark into the underside of his workbench for every sober week. 143 marks, hidden where only he could see them. I knew because I knew where a craftsman keeps his secrets in the joints no one inspects. On the first day of April, Theo Voss arrived unannounced. He was 80 now, slower on the path, his cane finding each cobblestone with the patience of a man who understood that the ground owed him nothing. I met him on the porch. He carried a leather satchel, the same one he had carried the day I first arrived on this island. Disoriented and gutted, and holding a single iron key like a drowning man holds driftwood. "One last delivery," he said. He placed the satchel on the table between our coffee cups. Inside was a single envelope, cream-colored. Vivian's handwriting. The ink slightly faded, but the letters as precise as architectural drafting. Envelope 397. I had read 396 letters over 3 years. One for every month she had lived with the knowledge of what her children were capable of, and the determination to build something stronger than their cruelty. But this was different. The others had been numbered, filed, organized into the color-coded system she had designed for my discovery. This one bore no number, only a date. April 1, 2021. The day she died. I opened it alone. Theo understood. He took his coffee to the garden and sat beside Vivian's roses, the ones Margot had grafted and regrafted, until they bloomed in colors that did not exist in nature. Coral and violet. Impossible and beautiful. Like forgiveness. The letter was short. 11 sentences. I will not reproduce them all here because some words belong only to the silence between two people who built a life together without ever fully seeing the blueprints. But the last 3 sentences I will carry until the sawdust settles for good. You were never the hired help, Walter. You were the architect of everything that mattered. And the house you are building now, the one without walls, will stand longer than anything I ever put on paper. I folded the letter along its creases, placed it in my shirt pocket, over my heart, where a carpenter keeps his pencil. That evening I walked to the workshop alone. The lights were off, the wood stove cold. Sawdust covered the floor in patterns that told the story of the day's work. Pine shavings near the lathe where Garrett had been turning table legs, oak chips by the bench, where Tommy taught a new student the geometry of a mortise. I ran my hand along the workbench. 47 years of splinters and solutions lived in the grain of that wood. Every nick was a lesson. Every stain was a story. And every joint, dovetail, mortise, tenon, tongue, and groove was a decision to hold 2 separate pieces together through pressure and precision rather than glue and hope. I reached into my pocket. Not for the letter. For the key. The iron key that had started everything. Rusty. Heavy. Unchanged by time, because iron does not forget its shape. I placed it in the center of the workbench. Beneath it, a fresh napkin. On the napkin, a single line drawn in pencil. A house for those who were never given one. The next dormitory. The next foundation. The next 47 napkins, waiting to become something real. Then I turned off the workshop light, stepped into the April night, and walked home across an island where no cars existed, no engines ran, and the only sound was the lake meeting the shore the way it had for 10,000 years. Patient, relentless, and entirely unconcerned with the small empires men built and lost along its edge. The key was behind me. The work was ahead. And that, I have learned, is the only inheritance worth leaving.